Good evening and welcome to The Common. My name is Kevia Carter, and tonight I'll be bringing you the next installment of the Pause series. Tonight I'd like to explore a topic called making sense of God's plans in times of uncertainty. Given everything that's occurred over the past year, I feel it's a pretty safe bet to say that you've all experienced some uncertain times. We've witnessed fallout from the pandemic and loss and heightened racial tensions and political turmoil and just overall changes to our way of life. And as Christians, we believe that God is good and God is sovereign. And we believe that we hold on to that belief until we're thrown unexpected curveballs. And so tonight I want to explore how we handle these times of uncertainty, especially when what we seem to be hearing from God just doesn't seem to make sense to us. The verse for tonight is going to be coming from Joshua, chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. And it reads, "Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, and everyone straight in.'" Now, this particular passage gave me pause for a couple of reasons, but in order to understand that, let's get a little bit of context. What we know about Joshua at this point in time is that he's leading the Israelite army on their quest to occupy the land of Canaan, which is the land that God had promised to the ancestors of Abraham. And in order to do this, they had to conquer the city of Jericho. Earlier in Joshua had spies sent into the city, and they meet with Rahab, and they come back. Sorry, we just gonna take that. Okay. So earlier we know that in order to fulfill this quest, in order to occupy that land, they had to conquer the city of Jericho. Now, Jericho is a city that was fortified with this really big wall, and they had to get past it in order to take over the city. And what God tells them, the instructions that God gives, is quite literally, march around the wall for 6 days. You march around the wall one time for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, you do that 6 times. And you blow the trumpet. You do that 7 times. And then you blow the trumpet. And then everyone in the army shouts, and the wall is going to come down. If you're Joshua at this point in time, you've seen God move in a lot of miraculous ways. He has brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, away from slavery. He's helped them to escape the Egyptian army by parting the Red Sea. He's been with them in the wilderness. And when they were disobedient and stuck there for 40 years, he kept them and sustained them. And now that they're finally making their way into the promised land, they get up, and this is one of the first obstacles that they have to overcome. And the instructions that they're given is to march around the wall, and then the wall comes down. That doesn't sound like a really good battle plan. When you hear that, it gives you pause. Even when you've seen God move in that way, it's something that says, wait a minute, God, what's going on? How could this possibly work? All right? Why is this even important for today, Kevia? Well, at some point in time, we'll all come across our Jericho moments. There'll be a point in time where we'll have to overcome an obstacle, and God gives us instructions that may not make a whole lot of sense, right? And so for me, that caused me to try to understand why sometimes what we hear may not make sense to us. And part of the answer I found in 1 Corinthians. And so specifically coming from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 27 through 29, the Apostle Paul says this: "But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him." At this point in time, the Apostle Paul helps us to understand that sometimes God intentionally uses things that oppose conventional wisdom in order to bring greater glory to his name. The letter that he writes in 1 Corinthians is addressed to the church at Corinth, which is at that point in time was a Greek city, which means that it was heavily under Greek influence. Greek culture at that time placed a high premium on wisdom and philosophy. And so for them, even at that point in time, Paul had to step in and allow them to know that although this is something that's important to you, although understanding wisdom and philosophy is important, God's wisdom does not look like our wisdom. God's wisdom and human wisdom are two very different things. And so a few other important things is that, God's wisdom and human wisdom are very different, right? And so even for the church at that time, that church was struggling with some of the same things that we have struggles with today. They had division and sexual immorality and jealousy and materialism. They experienced a lot of the same struggles that we have today. And that was because of their cultural environment, right? And so for us, one thing that we have to really understand is that sometimes you may hear God tell you to do things that don't seem to make sense, and that's because he's not going by conventional human wisdom, right? And so God intentionally flips human wisdom on his head so that we don't get so caught up in ourselves, so that we don't find glory in ourselves. One thing that we know is that although human wisdom is severely limited by human perspective, we can still find a way to boast. We can still find a way to say, I'm the smartest, I did that, I figured that out. And God says, What happens is that with human wisdom, it's defined by, or it's influenced by human perspective, which is limited. We cannot and we do not have all of the pieces of the puzzle. When we enter into a situation, when we see things, it's specifically based on our lived experiences. And so with God, God is not like that. We serve a God that sees all, that knows all, that operates in eternity. And so his wisdom is much more all-encompassing than ours. And so one of the things that we have to understand is that when God tells us to move, when God says something, even if it does not make a lot of human sense, we still want to listen. Why is that? Well, going back to Joshua, one thing that we understand is that the way that Joshua operated was the right way, and that the way that Joshua operated in that situation was the right way. Even though what he heard from God didn't make a lot of conventional sense, it didn't sound like the strongest battle plan, and if anyone else had told him to do that, he probably would have looked at them as though they were crazy. He did it. He didn't question God. That was the battle plan that he employed. And guess what? On the seventh day, the wall did come down. Joshua operated in obedience. Well, why is that? Well, again, I mentioned earlier that Joshua had seen God work in supernatural ways before. And so for him, although the plan itself may not have made a lot of sense, he knew that when God told him to move, that God would do, he would do what he said he would do. All right? And so he operated on faith. Not necessarily what he heard and what he thought about and what he understood, but faith, the faith in the God that had brought them through every obstacle prior to now. And so then, How do we have faith like Joshua? Where does that come from, right? He got a chance to witness God do supernatural things. Well, what if that hasn't been my experience? How do we have faith like him? Well, one thing we have to understand is that having faith means trusting God when we do not have all the pieces, right? And so if you knew every step of God's plan, how he planned to move us forward from here, how he planned to bring about something good out of this pandemic, how he planned to bring unity instead of division, if we knew every step of the way, if we knew everything that he wanted to do in our lives, then we wouldn't need faith. You would have a God that didn't have to be that big because you had everything already. Faith means that we are trusting in who he is, even though we don't necessarily know the next step. And so our faith is built on knowing who God is. One thing that the word is clear about is not going to necessarily give you the next step in God's plan for your life directly. That's not how that works. God may tell you to move, and you may not understand what that move is. You may not understand why he's asking you in the move you may not understand why he's asking you to move in the way that he is instructing you to move. What you do know, what we can get from the Bible, is a full understanding of God's character. And so when we know his character, we build our faith. The word that we have full access to tells us what we need to know about our God and why we follow him, why we operate in obedience versus hesitancy. The word tells us that we have a Father who loves us so much that he sent his only Son to earth to die for our sins. The Bible tells us that we have a God that will never leave us and will never forsake us. The Bible tells us that we serve a God who cannot lie. If nothing else, we know who our God is. And because we know who he is, we have the ability to walk alongside him and to trust in his directions, even when they don't make a lot of sense to us. I want to thank you all for joining me tonight, and we'll see you again next week.